So once I've shown my block out to my client or to my lead, or if it's just for my own work, I've kind of spent time to kind of take a step back, let it breathe, and then look at it and sort of make sure I'm happy with it. Then the next stage for me is to start kind of refining the block out, because I'm sort of happy with the overall shape. So I need to start thinking about how is this thing actually constructed. So at the moment what I'm doing is I'm taking this tail section and I'm actually thickening out the kind of outer armor in order to sort of give it believability. And then I'm also taking the darker areas that will be kind of a dark painted metal, splitting that off and then just having it as single faces inside, because I do plan on this being a game res model. So what I want to do is not model the pieces together because I want to save on the amount of geometry, but I also need to be careful not to waste space on polygons that is hidden in order to save that space for textures later. So now what I'm doing is I'm designing in a panel in order to access this area of the kind of like mechanics of how the tail would rotate. And every so often I'm going through and I'm just beveling edges that I think could be rounder. You'll notice that the vehicle in general is quite kind of hard edge. There's a lot of just kind of like 40 plus degree angles that I'm just leaving as single edges at the moment. That's because what I want to do is build up the general look of the whole vehicle, and then when I'm happy, any kind of convex edges over about 40 degrees will get a single bevel on them, and then I'll use my force normals or face weighted normals in order to make those look like nice big bevels for Unreal Engine. And then any kind of inner faces, then they will stay hard because it gives me a better result. By hard I mean as a single edge with hardened normals, because it'll give me a better result, and also it's much cheaper on poly count. So now I'm just kind of like refining the way the engine works more, giving it a little bit more detail on the jet. And this is the kind of thing that I'll go around kind of increasing the level of detail in the areas that I want to tell a story, because I obviously want the player's eye to be drawn to these spaces. So I'll start to push the amount of detail up, make these areas interesting to look at, and also then that will help to sort of tell the overall story of what it's for. So now I'm kind of just dividing up different areas because I'm thinking of how would I optimize this in the way it's modeled for Unreal Engine, but also make sure that I'm using the minimum amount of polygons in order to make sure that my normals are nice and clean. And then once it's a nice simple shape, then I'm taking that area, giving it thickness so it looks like hard panel work, and then pulling those sort of like darker areas in that I want to be sunken and protected by the outer body work, making sure that's separated off so that it feels like a different asset, and trying to give, even across like flat faces, a bit of depth, whether that's panel lines or whether it's just lower details, deeper details, just to help to stop my design from having any kind of large open flat spaces where I don't want them. So now all I'm doing is I'm basically capping this intake with just a couple of flat polygons. Rather than modeling all of this together, which would cost more in poly count, then I'm just using literally a couple of planes to cap the inside of the vent. Because then what I'll probably do is have an actual mesh with an alpha in front of that in order to create the look of some sort of grid or actual vent that stops anything big being pulled in. And I'll need something to cap behind that in order to capture the light, bake AO2. And you'll notice this, I did the same thing on the metal parts of the front of the vent, was that I just made sure I was happy with the overall shape of it, deleted all of the unneeded faces, and then thickened the whole thing up, just to make sure it looks like a nice thick piece of body armor, basically. So once I kind of gone through this process of doing it over the whole vehicle, then I'll start to bevel all of those kind of harder edges in order to make it start to look like something that I could actually ship in a game. And then start to delete all of the wasted spaces. The wasted space might just be reducing the size of polys as opposed to getting rid of them completely, in order to save on the texture space required for the masks and AOs that I'll bake to this later. So now what I'm doing is basically doing the same thing, where I'm separating it off and then extruding it in to give it that thickness that it needs, and then just delete the kind of like wasted faces. In this case, I'm just pulling it in order to give it more depth to the body armor, because I know that we're going to have close-ups of the gun and the camera, for example. So in those areas, I just want to make it look like there is some sort of an infrastructure that is sitting underneath the outer bodywork that then it's attached to. So what we'll do is we'll think about how we can use floating normal decals to add bolts and connections to these panels to make it look like that every panel can be detached from the vehicle and replaced if it's damaged, or repainted over time and things like that, just like a car or a current day helicopter or something. So this is basically me continuing with that progress, or that process. Is just defining the areas that make up one panel, splitting those off from all the other polys, kind of defining that, and then when I'm happy with it, then I choose the whole thing, thicken it up, give it some depth, and then just make sure it feels separate to this underlying darker sort of framework that makes up the actual underside of the drone. So obviously this is something you're going to see quite a lot. So if you want to speed up the videos, or if you want to skip certain elements once you feel like you have the sort of general vibe of what I'm doing, that's completely fine. But I'll just kind of continue to talk about my thought process as I'm doing it. So also one thing I'm doing is, although I'm happy with the general bodywork, I might still kind of like work on the silhouette of certain elements like I'm doing right now. So I haven't just confined myself to saying, okay, now this asset is like how I want it to look, so I need to start pushing it towards finished. Because I'm using like a mid-poly workflow, I'm not going to build a high poly and then bake that down to a low poly. I'm not having to commit and say, okay, this is my finished asset, so now I just need to wrap this up. I'm going to constantly iterate on the overall design, even as I push certain elements towards finished. So what I'm doing now is designing just another kind of like panel connection into this piece. So it looks like maybe this is something that the engineers could use to access this kind of area of the drone, and maybe open this front panel. And then what I'll probably do is, to add some more detail to this, then I would take some normal decals that maybe look like handles or bolts or something like that, and float those over the actual panel. And every so often I'm just going through, flicking into my progressive render tab, seeing how it looks under lighting instead of in a flat lighting environment in the viewport, seeing if these details work, if I feel the separation between the panels is big enough, just to really kind of like I said, break up the actual spaces that make up the bodywork around the outside of the vehicle. And here I'm just kind of tidying up this shape. So I'm thinking, okay, I don't need all of this white space under the vent. So I'm thinking, how do I tidy this up, turn it into an actual usable panel? And then once the tidying up is done, then I can take the actual panel, split it off from the rest of the asset, give it that thickness like I've been doing with everything else. So that's what I've just done there. So I'm deleting the unnecessary stuff. And now I'm going to take this panel in a second and just do the same process of thickening it up. And then this gives me the opportunity to think about, okay, now if this thing is panels, then I also need to make sure that the underlying dark painted metal will also fill the spaces that I need it to fill. Because obviously on all of these panels, when I extrude it and give it depth. Once I plan on taking it to UE4, the sides of the panels will stay, but the underlying faces of the panels, they'll just get deleted because they're unnecessary. They're just going to be facing inside. They'll never be seen. So at the moment, I'm giving them thickness and I'm leaving those faces there just because it's a little bit easier for me to iterate on the whole panel shape. And then once I'm happy, then I'll go through and clean those up. So now again, what I'm doing is giving it that depth and separation like I mentioned before. So just giving it some silhouette. And I'm imagining that this sort of curved face underneath the vent is probably going to be pipe work or some sort of very basic silhouette heavy modeling that shows kind of like how maybe those pieces could be kind of like pipe work or something that connects to the actual engine. So now I'm simply just taking these faces, turning them into circles, and then extruding them in because I want it to look like all of these are just connection points to the kind of outer area of this pivot, and then the inner area pivots around inside that outer area. I'll probably, rather than baking this piece to give it the detail, then I would just leave those edges hard because that will give me a nicer result in my lighting and stuff anyway. Because I don't plan on baking any kind of like large elements because I don't want it to become very expensive. So the only baked normal maps will be for sort of like small, very important elements because I need this thing to not be much more expensive than a mid-size asset. And what you've seen me just do is I've taken a couple of faces, modeled that into a shape that I like, and then I've duplicated it around 3 times and then Boolean those shapes out of the original shape. And I haven't cleaned up the topology there yet because that could be something that I do later. So with these faces then, or with these small details, then what I'll do is I'll tend to model them in, go into my progressive render, see how I feel they read. And also if I feel that maybe they're not that strong at the moment, I'll remember how I imagine they'll look once I've baked in my AO map and once I've like used AO in Unreal Engine in general. So Unreal Engine's screen space, AO is obviously nowhere near as accurate and as nice as a kind of offline rendered AO map would be, but it does do a pretty good job. But what I would do is I will bake AO maps into the entire vehicle and then I'll combine that with screen space AO. So I'll take the AO maps I bake for the entire asset to give it depth and contact and stuff like that. And I'll combine that I'll add that into the material so it has its own AO, and then that'll be combined with screen space AO to really help to give it the depth. So now all I'm doing is making sure that my symmetry is correct. What you've seen me just do is delete half of some panels and then re-symmetrize them in order to make sure that I'm not making a mess as I go. Because sometimes I'll make a mistake and I'll accidentally turn symmetry off a model on one side. So rather than kind of undoing the work, I'd rather just delete half, re-symmetrize, and just continue. Because the more I get used to making the mistakes, the faster I get. Because I think part of 3D is learning that you do make these weird mistakes all the time. And then as you learn to just work with them, then you actually start to make the mistakes less anyway. And you'll realize that over time you're not working in a way where you don't make mistakes anymore. You're constantly doing it, especially as you're trying to learn new techniques and push yourself. So you'll notice that, say like the bottom of the vent, that is quite a big sweeping curve that I want to make. So in that case, I'll use like a 5-faced or 5-edged bevel because that's the size I want it to be. Because that simply wouldn't work if I didn't give it that amount of polys on an asset that I do plan on being quite large. If you remember the size of the scale man, he was only as tall as kind of that vent intake on the front. One thing, looking back at the whole process for this vehicle that I missed was more elements to help give the vehicle scale. So something I try and do in my designs, and I think I missed a bit on this design, is to make sure that you build elements into it that people recognize right away, and then they can help to give it scale. So this drone, for example, when I present it, will probably need to at least have one image where it's presented with the silhouette of a figure near it to give it a sense of scale. Because if you see this for the first time in an image and you've never seen the design before, you could quite happily think that this asset is only kind of like a 1 meter long drone or 3 feet long drone, and really it's kind of supposed to be 7 or 8 meters or kind of 20 feet. So yeah, that's definitely something I feel that I failed on this. But that's something for you to think about with your designs, I think. So what you'll see is now that I'm kind of happy with the shape of the overall panel work, then I'm going through and just giving it a little bit more size. So, or not size, but kind of like curvature and depth to the actual panel work. So on these big kind of edges, then I want to give it actual proper bevels, because they're quite a few centimeters across, and I want to be able to zoom right into this vehicle and take screenshots from very close. Like if I was in a first person game, I'd want to be able to run right up to the vehicle, put my hand on it, and for it to be able to stand up to kind of like the expectations of a 2019 gamer. And then what I would do is if there was going to be any element on the vehicle where you would need to actually interact with it, say level design had designed in any kind of like panel work that needed to be opened, then that stuff would probably be baked, and just to make sure it really had the kind of highest fidelity possible. So now what I'm doing very quickly is I'm instancing the kind of like hover pads so that I can go to the original instance and model those flat on the ground, which just makes it a little bit easier for me to model extra detail in, because I'm not working with the whole sort of viewport sort of like rotated 30 degrees to one side and stuff like that. So I'm just going to go in, start adding more detail into this area, and as I render it, then you can see that the instance is actually on top of the vehicle that I'm moving around now, and the base model is sat on the ground. I do this with the kind of like jets on the side, or the boosters on the side as well, because I'll just want to model one and have it instanced around the whole vehicle. And then also with the jet's got kind of booster on the back of the vehicle, I'll instance that too, because what I want to be able to do is basically model with it on a nice kind of like it's at 0, 0, it's facing straight up, it's not a funny angle, and it makes it a lot easier for my modeling tools. And then when I'm happy with the designs and I feel the pieces are finished, because I could take the instances basically all the way to finished, and during my process I can export the instances out as individual assets and put them into Unreal Engine while I'm kind of finishing up. And at the end, when I want to optimize it down to only a few meshes for the whole vehicle, then they would all just be combined together. And it's one of those things where it's like you can easily kind of take a step back, continue working on your instances, and then it's very easy to just kind of like take a few seconds or a minute to combine the instances together. So my main thing is I want to work on a game asset that I can also receive feedback on from an art director after I think it's finished, and not be super upset that I need to basically restart the whole thing. Because if I had a huge asset like this and I'd taken it to final and I'd UV'd the entire thing 0 to 1, and then all of the bevels and all of the detail was coming from normal maps, and then he asked for new detail that doesn't fit into the UV map or just generally fresh design, then I would kind of panic, because I would lose those UVs that were set up, I would lose the normal maps, I would maybe have to go through that entire long, very, very kind of error-prone bake process. Whereas in this case, what I can do is, because I'm going to tile all of my textures across the whole asset and just use some very basic baked normal maps that will just be Atlas UV'd, then it's very easy for me to say, okay, I can add this sort of destroyed section here, or I can do a variation that has crashed and has some elements sticking out and burning materials on it and stuff like that. And it's all very easy for me to do. So iteration is very important to me. I don't want to basically be able to iterate on the high poly and then have to make my art director commit to the high poly and then say to them, I'm not willing to change anything after the high poly phase. I want to be able to say, okay, this is something that I can work on for a couple of weeks at work. And then if he says last minute, oh, I've decided that I want to change this, it's not necessarily because he's indecisive, but he may not have time to look at my design while I'm working on it. Or we could get feedback 6 months later from design that says that some sort of interactive element or something like that is just not clear to the player when they play, so we need to do that. So iteration is kind of key with this workflow. So I kind of that's why I refer to this workflow as mid-poly modeling, because then it's easy for me to go in and continue my mid-poly model because I'm not having to update a high poly and a low poly, etc. So all I'm doing while I ramble about workflows is just continuing to refine these shapes. So I'm quite happy with the general panels. So I'm just adding those extra bevels in order to make them feel nice. Giving them these kind of like creases, which in like a car, for example, almost all cars have a crease running all the way down the side of the vehicle from the front wheels to the back wheels that go right through the center of the door. And that's because that crease makes that part of the panel the strongest part of the kind of makeup of the side of the vehicle. So that if a car crashes into the side of your car, then that crease that's been created in the manufacturing process is much less likely to buckle than the flat side of a panel, which will buckle very easily. So that's what I'm trying to design into this vehicle as well, is I'm trying to imagine where could collisions happen, where could this thing need to be quite structurally sound, and then I'm adding in those kind of creases and then giving it that extra bevels to make it look like it could take a hit. And at the moment what I'm doing is I've just taken the actual panel shape that I kind of left for a little while to see if I liked it, and I've taken the panel shape, Boolean subtracted it away from the model, cleaned up the topology, and then I've just taken the original panel and just made it very slightly smaller. So the details on the panel will be normal, like floating normal decals, like bolts and handles and things like that. But around the outside, I want the actual panel lines to have actual depth and modeling to them, because you can really tell in the lighting and especially in the AO when that's kind of modeled in. So that's definitely areas where if your poly count just can't be as high, then those are things you could save. You could just have the entire panel being a floating normal that you could just project onto those faces. So between these kind of smaller details, I'm going through and just refining, as you've seen me doing for the last kind of 20 minutes, is just going through, refining and saying, okay, where do I want to add this extra information, because I want the light to play across these faces really nicely. It won't necessarily always be matte materials that I have on this. Maybe I want to have quite kind of like glossy materials, or maybe even if it is matte, when it's raining and I get a lot of light play across the faces, then I want light play to actually have polygons to use in order to give nice sort of curvature to the lighting effects on the vehicle, which is something that if you try and do through a normal map will just break down once your bevels are kind of like getting bigger than a couple of centimeters. So I'd rather give the actual polygons for the game engine to work with. So I'm just kind of taking it into my progressive render, having a look at it. As you can see, when I move my mouse around, the render accelerates around my mouse, which is why it looks like I'm kind of scribbling on the renders quite often, is I'm just moving my mouse around the area where I'm interested, and then the render speeds up in those areas just to give me an idea of like am I happy with that area? And then I can just skip the rest of the render. So now I'm just going through and I'm thinking, how hard would it be for me as an engineer to replace these kind of back wings? What kind of materials do I want them to be? Maybe I want them to be this dark material because then it helps to give that contrast at the back and then draws the eye away from the wings and more to the sort of panel work. And maybe at some point I'll decide, no, I kind of need the wings to be a nice important element that's built into the panel work as well, because they do tell a story. So at the moment I'm just going through and I'm making sure that my individual pieces are really kind of like separated up now. And then maybe I need to combine certain areas in order to be modeled together. So this is just another panel that I'm selecting now. So now you can see that kind of like intake area at the back, or sort of like the outtake area at the back, is now separate from the panel work completely. And then I can go into the panel work and say, okay, I need to create better panel lines between those. So now that I'm kind of happy with the overall, that I've sort of thickened up all the panel work and decided where the bevels would be on the body, then I want to go into these kind of boosters or jump jet type things on the sides and just start to give this some more information. So at the moment I'm looking at my overall shape and I'm saying, okay, I need to give it some bigger kind of silhouette changes to make it really interesting. And while I do that, I'm looking at my PureRef reference board at lots of designs that I've seen on the internet and said, okay, what have they done? What could I borrow and take to this design that I really like? As you can see, I'm modeling on my original jump jet, which is at 0, 0. In order to make my modeling easier, I can use symmetry and stuff like that. And I'm just trying to decide kind of like what sort of shapes will look cool. So I've extracted these shapes because I'm planning on creating a Boolean on the side. So I'm just basically taking the polys off the side of the actual jump jet, and I'm thinking this dark face that I'm working on now is going to be the Boolean that I'm going to cut out of this asset. I'm adding extra edge loops just so that it doesn't break when I do the Booleans. And I'm generally just sort of like working on the overall shape of the engine to make it feel more interesting. So I'm just going around now and Booleaning the actual pieces out. And then I'll just tidy up the polys a little bit, just so that we don't have any like duplicated verts or broken faces. And this will make it a lot easier when I come to kind of optimize it, make sure it's not too expensive, but also keeping the cleanliness and simplicity in my modeling makes it a lot easier for me to continue modeling. And as you can see, every so often I'm just going into my progressive render, seeing if this looks nice in the lighting setup that I want. I can see that as I'm modeling on my original, all of my instances are updating as well, so that even though my original model is sat on 0 and is clipping through the ground when I render, I can still look at the entire vehicle and I can say, do these jump jets feel like they're becoming too busy, or are they uninteresting at the moment? The whole time I'm doing this, I'm imagining that not all of my detail needs to come from modeled in detail. I can still add frequency and noise and interest to this using floating normals, which will obviously look like they're modeled into the asset. And then on top of that, I can also use decals. So maybe on these jump jets, I would want to do something that looks a little bit like engines on a commercial airliner. So maybe I'd want decals to say, maybe it's just like a flight or an aircraft number for the vehicle, or maybe I want my OTEC branding on it or Reaper branding on it. So now I'm thinking that this darker area below is quite a hardy area, which is designed to kind of deflect and control the direction of the actual energy that's coming out of these. So when I'm doing this, I'm looking at sort of the underside of rockets that are used currently and the back end of like the afterburners on fast jets. And I'm thinking, okay, how do I make these look quite similar so that when someone looks at these, then they're relatively recognizable and people can understand it? Because when someone sees this vehicle for the first time, I can't be there to explain to them what the shapes are. So I need to make sure that these are things that are relatable to the actual person who's going to see this. Because if potentially I'm going to make something that needs to feel homogeneous with the overall design of the game or the movie I'm working on, and I can't be there to explain to them what my thought process was, then I need to make sure that I'm working on it in terms that they'll understand already. So I'm trying to make this look like it's typical bodywork that's around the outside of a jet. Then on the underside, then it's like a harder material that can deflect the energy. And then on the inside, then it's just the typical kind of look that looks like an afterburner. So that people hopefully have seen things like Top Gun and all these different movies over the years, and just general images of jets and things like that, recognize the shapes, and then they'll understand what my thought process was, and hopefully understand that this vehicle is doing the job that I want it to do. So now I'm just going through and kind of refining how the gun actually would connect to the vehicle and how it would pivot. And then I've separated the gun off, made it an instance again, so that the instance that's actually on the vehicle, I can keep moving it and pivoting it around until I'm happy with the overall silhouette of the vehicle. And the original gun I can also scale and model into and not worry about how it's kind of conflicting with the vehicle, because I can see what it's doing just by looking at the original group that has the instance in it and doing a render like this and seeing how that affects the overall kind of design and silhouette of it. So now I'm just continuing, and I'm using the very minimum amount of edges and faces I can on my bevels in order to give it the kind of like large, nice curves I want. And now when I look at this render, then I can see that I'm just much happier with how this is playing with the light, and I feel like this is feeling a bit kind of tighter. So I could take this, which is my more sort of refined Blockout, show this to my art director and see what he thinks.